Before I start with the topic of my lecture, I would like to say a few words about the title of my chair, Professor of Hebrew Bible and Second Temple Judaism. The Hebrew Bible part refers to the scriptures known in Judaism as Tanakh and among Christians as the Old Testament. Jesus and his immediate followers have considered the Hebrew Bible, which by then circulated also in Greek translation, as their scriptures. Turning to the Second Temple period, most of you will be familiar perhaps with the first temple built by Solomon and destroyed by the Babylonians early in the 6th century BCE. According to the biblical account, which for the reign of David and Solomon is highly contested, this first temple stood from around 960 to 586 BCE, a little under 400 years. The second temple was built in the late 6th century after the policies of the Persian king Cyrus made it possible for Judean exiles to return from Babylon and rebuild their temple. This is a model of the second temple at the Israel Museum. We hear of this operation particularly in the books of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, as well as Ezra and Nehemiah. The events of the return are also the backdrop to the message of comfort of what scholars know as Second Isaiah. This second temple stood from around 515 BCE to 70 CE, when it was brought down by the Romans. Thus, the Second Temple period lasted almost 600 years, which is significantly longer than the lifespan of the First Temple. A sizable constituency of scholars would date a large amount of the Hebrew Bible to this Second Temple period. So the part of my title that refers to the Hebrew Bible is therefore not entirely separate from my focus on the Second Temple period. The 20th century German New Testament scholar Wilhelm Busse referred to this period as late Judaism, Spätjudentum, expressing a theological form of anti-Semitism that portrays Judaism as an inferior husk for Christianity. Finally, another label that was used widely was the idea of a post-exilic period, to refer to the period after the Babylonian exile had come to an end. Given it is impossible for us to know what proportion of exiles did or were able to return, it is problematic to assume the exile or forced migration, as such phenomena are referred to today, did return. In any case, we are certainly left with an incredibly influential Jewish diaspora in Babylonia, a community that centuries later gave us one of the foundational texts of Judaism, the Babylonian Talmud. In sum, while any historical periodization can be nuanced further, Second Temple period is a helpful label that encompasses mostly imperial rule over the province of Judah by Persian, Greek, and Roman empires. Though not all texts discovered in the Judean wilderness go back to the Second Temple period, the manuscripts found at Qumran make up the Dead Sea Scrolls in the narrow sense, and all go back to this period. So let me now turn to those scrolls. 70 years ago this year, the first of what are now almost 1,000 often fragmentary ancient Jewish manuscripts were discovered in 11 caves at the site of Qumran and near the site, a small settlement on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The manuscripts were dated to the 2 centuries prior, the first century after the turn of the era. First, they were dated with the aid of paleography, an analysis of the development of handwriting, and more recently also with the latest carbon-14 tests that can be conducted with very small samples of precious ancient material. In what follows, I will try to sketch some key insights we have gained over the course of 70 years about the Dead Sea Scrolls and evaluate their significance. I will reflect on my own contribution and current thinking along the way, and also attempt to draw some connecting threads with some of the excellent research that goes on in this college and more broadly at the university. Perhaps the most important starting point that lies at the start of any project, and I hope our talented undergraduates are listening, be that in the sciences or the humanities and the social sciences, are the questions we ask. A lot of the time, we are all agreed on the questions that need to be asked. In the case of the newly discovered Dead Sea Scrolls, what was to become a famous consensus view on the people behind the Dead Sea Scrolls arose to a large extent by a consensus of what questions to ask of the new evidence. This consensus view supposed the scrolls belonged to one of several ancient sects, the celibate Essenes, who differed from Pharisees and Sadducees on matters of law and their views on life after death or the absence of it. The latter being something the Sadducees are reported to have denied. We don't actually know what the Sadducees themselves thought, but we have a number of different sources telling us what they think they thought. Quite naturally, these pioneering men of early Qumran research, and they were all men in the early days, had the mammoth task of identifying and piecing together many of the world's hardest jigsaw puzzles, all mixed into one pile of pieces and delivered in random batches to your door. Here you see some of the jigsaw puzzles in action in the so-called scrollery. It was easier to piece together those parts of a jigsaw where we recognized parts of a well-known picture, such as the book of Genesis or Isaiah. Some of the jigsaw pictures, however, were entirely unknown to any of us, and fortunately some of those came down to us almost completely assembled. Here you've got 3 columns of the community rule from Cave 1 that goes on until column 11, so it's quite a well-preserved jigsaw puzzle or scroll. My work on the scrolls has focused on those previously unknown texts. In addition to the texts, questions raised themselves also about the relationship of the texts to the nearby settlement, which was excavated a few years later. And going back to the slides about the men, I can see some masculinity studies projects possibly still there for the scrolls themselves and perhaps for the research as well, maybe being done as we speak somewhere. In the face of this almost insurmountable challenge, it was natural to approach the new material with a cluster of questions that were aimed at filling gaps in our historical cartography. In order to begin to comprehend what was in front of us, it was essential to begin by orientating ourselves at points of interest and looking for the equivalent of the mark on a map that tells you, you are here. My own scholarly journey benefited from orientation gained by the earlier discovery of 2 manuscripts in a synagogue in Old Cairo at the close of the 19th century of a text later attested also in the Qumran caves, the Damascus document. So this text was miraculously preserved twice against the odds, once in medieval form in Cairo and once again at Qumran. The medieval manuscripts of the Damascus document are now housed in the Cambridge University Library, and I've shown you one page here, where they arrived in large part thanks to the tenacity of 2 impressive Victorian scholars, the Scottish twin sisters Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson. More recently, we have been more ambitious in our assessment of the wealth of primary ancient evidence and turned to redrawing the maps of ancient Judaism rather than putting the scrolls in their place, so to speak. The outputs of ancient scribes and legal scholars, such as those responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, take us to the period that gave rise to the emergence of Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism, from a time that has shaped our history and culture to this day, whether you are a person of faith or not. In addition to this forward-looking assessment of the significance of the scrolls, my more recent work has stressed remarkable continuity also with the circles and literature that lie behind the latest strands that make up the Hebrew Bible. This new hoard of ancient primary texts has the potential of closing some of the gaps found in the so-called dark period between the composition of the latest books of the Hebrew Bible and later Jewish literature, including the New Testament, which offers important insights into the history of both Judaism and emerging Christian communities that started, after all, with inner Jewish disagreements about Jewish law and messianic expectations. While few would disagree with the assessment of the significance of the scrolls outlined above, much of what one still reads in popular and scholarly literature would suggest the reach and influence of the material from Qumran to be rather localized, geographically, socially and culturally. This view is based partly on the geographically more or less remote location of the Qumran settlement in the Judean wilderness, some 28 miles from Jerusalem and 8 miles south of Jericho. The degree to which the site is isolated and remote is a topic that could fill another series of lectures. Suffice it to say that in recent years, archaeological features, once considered peculiar to the site, have been attested also at other sites in the Dead Sea regions, Jerusalem and beyond. These comparable finds include individual dining dishes rather than shared dishes, which was more common, large numbers of ritual immersion pools, and evidence for a similar burial practice in individual shaft graves, and they suggest both regional practices and an enhanced concern with ritual purity that is attested more widely in the centuries before and after the turn of the era. The curiosity factor. A second body of evidence that has stressed the particularity of the finds from Qumran are ancient accounts of the emergence in the 2nd century BCE of several Jewish sects. These accounts include descriptions of a group known as the Essenes, alongside Pharisees and Sadducees, in the work of Jewish and pagan authors, especially the 1st century CE Jewish historian Josephus and the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria. The Essenes also feature in Pliny the Elder's Natural History. These accounts are saturated by the author's Greco-Roman environment and prevailing ideals of a life of virtue. These writers often convey a sense of curiosity in their accounts of the Essenes. This sense of the obscure is echoed in Joan Taylor's assessment of 19th and early 20th century Christian scholarships of Judaism, where the Essenes appear as, I quote Joan, a peculiar anomaly. While there are noteworthy similarities between ancient descriptions of the Essenes and some Qumran texts, any meaningful comparison needs to be based on scrutinizing each corpus in its own right. First, this curiosity factor of the ancient Essenes lives on in the popular response to and reception of the Dead Sea Scrolls. As Matt Collins, who is here, and I'm delighted about that, has put recently, I quote, within the literary genre of the religio thriller, infamously epitomized by Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, no novel seems to be complete without the inclusion of some, often inaccurate reference to the Dead Sea Scrolls, most commonly in the context of Christian origins. I think, Matt, you've written the best part of this lecture. It is good to have Matt with us today. So, while both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essenes have courted the attention of the curious, I will now turn to what kind of thing attracted the attention of scholars, most of them curious too. And here I would like to introduce the category of attention-seeking evidence, which brings me to another aspect of the scholarly journey of engaging the fulsome cache of primary texts, noting my own contribution along the way. We mentioned above that research begins with a question that grabs our attention. Given self-respecting scholars are keen to offer groundbreaking research, and I'm hoping that our undergraduates are listening, we want you to start with that at master's level already. We ought to cast our attention to where others have not been, or to bring fresh perspectives on material that has been explored previously. For scholars of the Bible, the field of our evidence has been ploughed intensively. The discovery of just over 200 manuscripts that are 1,000 years older than previously available medieval copies of the Hebrew Bible, 1,000 years older, give or take a couple of recent forgeries not found in caves but on the antiquities market, has kept scholars of the history of the text of the Hebrew Bible busy, including a well-received Birmingham PhD by Drew Longacre. Concurrently, scientific and technical progress allows our attention to rest on an ancient codex spread across libraries in several countries, all in a single digital edition, as my Birmingham colleagues have done with Codex Sinaiticus. Digital technology and material science have also brought previously illegible text from Qumran to light. Scientific analysis can answer questions about where writing material, ink and pottery were prepared, as well as help us distinguish forgeries sold on the antiquities market. And here's an image of one of the material scholars, Ira Rabin, who is leading on a lot of the material research based in Berlin. For more information on these exciting developments, the pages of the journal Dead Sea Discoveries, which I edit, is a good place to start, and I'm honoured that both one of the founding editors and my predecessor are here today with us. In addition to thoughts about the direction and object of scholarly attention, I also continue to be intrigued by attention-grabbing features in the ancient texts themselves. We all do it. If we have something to say, we try to make it interesting, with varying levels of success. We see the same artistry with language in the scrolls. A good example are the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. This stark dualistic pairing is actually rather limited in the full corpus of the scrolls, and yet it frequently punches above its weight, so much so that Sons of Light is often used as a designation for the entire movement behind the texts, in preference to much more pervasive and less evocative terminology. Similarly, the teacher of righteousness and his adversaries, the wicked priest and the liar, have captured the imagination above and beyond the size of their literary footprint. These epithets almost sound like they belong to a Marvel cartoon. There is no doubt in my mind that the authors of such language wanted us to take note, and collectively we did. We almost jumped on this kind of language. Here, the expertise of my colleagues in English, language and applied linguistics offers opportunities for interdisciplinary conversations. It would be fun, I feel, to have coffee with the wicked priest and the liar and get their take on that self-satisfied teacher of righteousness, or rather the teacher's followers, who are much more tangible than the person of this elusive figure itself. The expertise of some of my colleagues in philosophy will help me think through this time travel project, at least the philosophical implications of it. A focus on a limited number of attention-grabbing features in the scrolls are gradually giving way to more nuanced assessments of the full corpus of texts. I have enjoyed foregrounding some neglected material lurking in dark corners of long-known texts. Before I get to some examples of what I would like to call the baseline, as in BASS, let me set the scene with some of the more memorable melodic parts in a text known as the Community Rule that I've been spending an unhealthy amount of my time with. I have chosen this analogy mainly because it is helpful, but also for my son Charles, who is a dab hand at the guitar. And I did get his permission to do this before anybody's worried about cruelty to teenagers in the course of this lecture. Let's start with the melody of the Community Rule. We have a sizable community led by a mixture of priests and lay leaders. Admission to full membership is protracted. After a probationary period, you might get access to the pure meal, and after 2 years, to the pure drink of the community. This all sounds rather similar to the journey of becoming part of the Birmingham professoriate, which culminates in dinner with the VC. There are meetings chaired by an overseer. We have plenty of those here also. Discipline is taken very seriously, ranging from moderate punishment for falling asleep, or indeed laughing too loudly, and to permanent expulsion for disrespectful behaviour towards the community and its teachings. It is clear that the virtues of the power nap had not been realised at this point, although I do believe they had several phases in the night, unlike us, so maybe that evened itself out. Even though this was one of the sources, that's the power nap, the sources of energy that charged the editor-in-chief of the full corpus of the Dead Sea Scrolls to immense success. Now, having listened to the melody, here is some of the bass line that I have suggested was rather suppressed by this sassy lead guitar. We come across groups in a variety of locations, not just at Qumran, in all their dwelling places, who come together to eat, bless and exchange counsel. We hear of a much simpler admissions process that mentions swearing an oath to return to the law of Moses and you're in. And most exciting of all, we find snippets of the same bass line in different texts, sometimes even in the Hebrew Bible. In a trajectory mirroring the scholarly study of the Bible over the course of several centuries, research on the Dead Sea Scrolls is moving away from a reading of the text as offering unmediated access to personalities, history and day-to-day life of the community. Pioneering scholars approach this material almost as if it were a candid camera producing what I have called reality literature. This is the Big Brother house. I know none of you would recognize this in all likelihood, but as it happens, the real significance of the scrolls is not so much what they tell us about a particular movement, but the preservation in situ of almost 1,000 ancient texts, often in several iterations. Whereas scholars would have expected to find different iterations of biblical texts, the fact that these different versions were preserved not in different communities or even different parts of the world, but side by side in the same place, allows us invaluable insights into the ways in which ancient scribes operated. This first-hand access to the scribal craft preserves corrections, insertions, and a great deal of drafting and redrafting. This is exciting because some of the most influential problems in the study of the Hebrew Bible concern the compositional history of the Pentateuch, Genesis to Deuteronomy, and of the so-called Deuteronomistic history, Joshua, Judges, Samuel and Kings. The first generations of biblical critics cut their teeth on this material, on the Pentateuch, and many, especially in my native Germany, still consider it a distinguishing feature of a serious scholar to propose a new solution to the problems of Pentateuchal scholarship. In the Anglo-Saxon and North American sphere, the biggest prize is more likely to go to those scholars who are most adept at debunking such efforts. What very few scholars on either side of this divide do is test their entirely hypothetical arguments against 2,000-year-old manuscripts where what some might have dismissed as scholarly jiggery-pokery actually occurred. So there are notable exceptions of scholars who work across the rather unhelpful divide of biblical and post-biblical material at this time. I guess we could compare the discovery of the scrolls to a long-lost video recording a piece of music that also happens to be 100 years older than any previous recordings. On this analogy, scholars of the scrolls began to look for the famous rift between the conductor and the first violin that they had read so much about, by paying close attention to their facial expressions, rather than focusing on the significance of the recording for the history of the orchestra. Another area where I have tried to amplify what we hear, to stay with my illustrative analogy of the oral, is the white noise that is emitted by the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I have chosen Hoover here because I know all of us will not afford to buy German or Continental for much longer with all those tariffs coming, so I just thought I will manage expectations. In a pair of recent publications, I've drawn attention to what I believe to be members of the movement that do not conform to the picture of the learned and highly literate elite scribes that are almost universally associated with the scrolls. To be sure, as I hope I've made clear above, the work of this influential stratum of literati, the scribbling classes, is in my view tremendously significant. But what happens if we go below stairs, Downton Abbey style? Neither the ancient texts nor modern scholars have directed our attention to those who took care of the tedious menial jobs. Someone always does. And I must stress that I did not set out to uncover the equivalent of below stairs at Qumran, but stumbled across it as I was puzzling about a particular group of texts. Now, I know that I have got some very good friends who are slightly more to the right than I am, but I'm not actually looking for left-wing organisations in the Dead Sea Scrolls quite yet. I started with the texts. I have mentioned above the gradual access to the common meal as described in some of the scrolls. It is almost impossible to overstate the significance of table fellowship, both in early Judaism and nascent Christianity. In various Jewish Christian communities, this issue, as part of the larger question of the place of Gentile converts, was arguably a key factor that shaped the gradual parting of the ways from Judaism in various Jewish Christian communities. In some ways, the disentangling from its Jewish context of what would become Christianities has echoes in our own time of Brexit. There were protracted discussions then as now on the proper legal framework to apply in the multicultural context of the Roman Empire. And then as now, deeply disturbing language is used by some to reflect upon this particular exit, which we may call Shrexit. Terrible, I know. I couldn't resist. I'm thinking here of the portrayal of the Jews in parts of the New Testament. One of the discussions that exercised communities was who could eat with whom. Given we are in an age before refrigerators and microwaves, where do I claim to hear white noise? In an article entitled "Who is Making Dinner at Qumran?" and I've got an image here of my daughter, Imogen, helping with making some food. I don't think it was dinner. I stress that the admissions process does not actually speak of eating and drinking, as usually assumed, but rather of touching the purity and the pure liquid of the community. I then put this important detail, the term touch rather than eat, into conversation with some fragmentary but clear references to harvesting foods that are susceptible to impurity by touch. This close reading of the text suggests the admission process described in the community rule would allow new members to get to work by supporting the harvest, preparing and serving food before partaking themselves. Such a reading of the text presupposes a more broadly skilled workforce and would sit well with the analysis of the site proposed by the archaeologist Dennis Misi, who identifies Qumran as associated with a sectarian community that also dedicated resources to agro-industrial efforts, especially the date industry. We are fortunate in this college to work with extremely talented colleagues in professional services who are not always apparent on the front pages of our outward-looking operation. I know I would not be here today giving this lecture without the tremendous support and skills of those colleagues, and I'm really touched that a number of them are here this evening because I know that they've had a very long day already. Literacy and scholarship in the Second Temple period and the question of widening participation. Moshe Halbertal, professor of Jewish thought and philosophy at the Hebrew University, locates the emergence of text-centeredness and the rise of the scholar in the Second Temple period. I hope that by the end of this lecture, many of you will embrace your Second Temple period roots as a common academic heritage that we all share. While the texts from Qumran reveal an extremely high level of technical learning and erudition, I have found the work of Brian Stock on textual communities helpful in thinking further about a more socially diverse makeup of the movement behind the scrolls. Stock's research focused on the 11th and 12th centuries CE monastic communities in France and suggests that textual communities attract groups to study texts, even though not all members of such communities are necessarily literate, and some may rely on interpreters to access the texts, something the New Testament scholar Chris Keith has helpfully called text brokers. Similarly, in the Roman context, William Johnson, like Stock, stresses the broader cultural value of elite texts which are disseminated orally to those unable to access the material independently. While I am certain that leading members of the movement whose outputs have reached us from Qumran will have been intimately involved with the transmission and production of this vast literature, it is likely that many, quite possibly a majority of members, relied on text brokers to mediate its contents. On Stock's hypothesis, For those unable to access texts directly, an association with the literature will nevertheless have been a central aspect of their identity as members of the same textual community. In addition to those members of the movement behind the scrolls who contributed to agricultural production and food preparation mentioned above, there was a need to maintain facilities, manufacture local pottery, and prepare animal skins for scroll production. Even though a scribal elite was responsible for the literary outputs that have survived, they were likely supported by both illiterate or semi-literate members in this textual community. I'm looking forward to talking more about a reconceived version of the now rightly abandoned analogy of Qumran and Christian monasteries with my colleague William Perkins from our history department. These observations are not irreconcilable with the fundamentally hierarchical vision of the community we find in the texts. There we read that new members, or those readmitted after temporary exclusion, sit in rank order. Now the training to be a scholar was intergenerational and required years of study, in some cases in several languages and scripts. On admissions, new members are enrolled according to their proficiency in the law and purity, in the appropriate rank. It is hardly conceivable that new members would work their way up along the lines of living the Qumran dream from washing dishes to millionaire. Thus we read elsewhere that those of inferior rank are to obey their superiors in matters of work and money, emphasis mine. I'm now struck by this reference to duties that were largely unremarked upon in our record. The largest number of references to work occur in material dealing with prohibited work during the festivals and the Sabbath, which does nevertheless imply work being carried out on other days. Granted that the appealing vision of a community of elite scribes sustained by their faith and erudition alone is almost certainly illusory, we need to allow for a less monolithic social and cultural environment in the textual community responsible for the literary riches unearthed at or near Qumran. As Michael Wise has recently noted, Hebrew literacy also served to fashion and sustain elites, as literacy did elsewhere in the Greco-Roman world. By trying to look beyond the content of the scrolls, to squeeze out as much insight as we can about the age and the people behind the material and other ancient scribes beyond, it is helpful to note Karen Barber's observations on the anthropology of texts from a background of working in African studies. And I'm delighted to have you in my vision, Karen. After noting the reflexive nature of texts which are committed to writing, and I quote, to attract attention and outlast the moment, Karen argues textual traditions can be seen as a community's ethnography of itself. End of quote. I find this description extremely helpful for what I'm trying to do. I would stress, however, that unlike previous research, I'm convinced that the broader community we are able to access indirectly via the scrolls is the entire contemporary Judean stratum of learned scribes and legal scholars. This can be achieved by recognizing overlapping accounts of activity in the scrolls and the Hebrew Bible, such as studying or meditating upon the law day and night that was practiced by pious groups behind the Hebrew Bible and the scrolls. We should also recognize that the movement behind the scrolls was compelled to wrestle with its identity and history in writing, just as the authors and redactors of the Hebrew Bible had done. If, as I have argued elsewhere, the constituency of scribes that gave us the Hebrew Bible is inevitably the larger group from which the Dead Sea Scrolls scribes were recruited, then this is precisely what one did with the tradition. And this is why we have the Bible in the first place. So if it's odd to have a lot of ancient literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's equally odd that we have the Bible. There is no need to imagine a purely administrative rationale for the huge investment in literary activity at Qumran beyond the immense literary appetite that characterized the time as a way of staking a claim to a community's place in the larger divine scheme. Finally, let me end by reflecting on the notion of whether or not the evidence of the site of Qumran suggests a life of austerity. A number of compositions use the language of poverty to refer to those addressed or described. Other passages use derogatory terminology such as wealth of wickedness. The community rule outlines a process to allow for the communal ownership of property, whereas the Damascus document advocates a distribution of 2 days' wages for those in need. A number of texts draw heavily on language associating poverty with virtue, known from biblical, prophetic and wisdom literature. Moreover, the site of Qumran is noteworthy by a scarcity of luxury goods. In one respect, however, the site of Qumran and its vicinity is also an economic hub, and that is when it comes to knowledge. In an article on the knowledge economy, Walter Poole and Kaiser Selman offer the following definition. We define the knowledge economy as production and services based on knowledge-intense activities. The key component of a knowledge economy is a greater reliance on intellectual capabilities than on physical inputs of natural resources. Clearly, I haven't got those capabilities to pronounce the word intellectual capabilities. The reference here to the production and services based on knowledge-intensive activities applies rather comprehensively to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The full publication of those scrolls has revealed texts that testify to a great deal of interest in astronomical, astrological and calendrical calculations and observations, which suggest some kind of connectivity with Babylonian and Hellenistic learning. The production in the widest sense of scrolls on the scale unearthed at and near Qumran presupposes a great deal of intellectual capital, both in terms of education and knowledge, and the acquisition of both is not economically neutral. In terms of the investment of resources, Qumran has revealed what appears to be, for ancient Palestinian Judaism, at least an eclectic cutting-edge deposit of learning. Rather than the holdings of an austere and isolationist movement, what we encounter in the vicinity of Qumran might just as accurately be described as a desert community of capitalists, and much of the intellectual and cultural capital attested here represents a significant segment of the knowledge economy of ancient Judaism. It is no exaggeration, therefore, to think of Qumran as the ancient equivalent of Silicon Valley, or rather Silicon Wadi. Some of the reasons why such an oasis of cultural wealth was not immediately recognized as such were spelt out at the start of this lecture. Almost from the word go, scholarly assumptions about the community focused on its particularity as a Jewish sect that had withdrawn from the world to live in isolation. It must also be stressed that it took the greatest part of the 70 years since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls for all the texts to be published, whereas we have been since the 1990s able to get a sense of the fuller picture in front of us. The first 40 years of scrolls research focused predominantly on the first 7 scrolls to be published. We now have almost 1,000 texts, some of them in multiple copies of the same or related texts. In addition to the more or less tangible evidence of the scrolls themselves, I hope to have been able to stress the intangible assets represented by such a vast repertoire, or rather probably a series of repertoires of ancient texts. The majority of members most likely lived an economically precarious life, with some, as Albert Baumgarten proposed, probably joining the group to ensure they could eat regularly. For others, we may be dealing with a phenomenon that may want to consider as a kind of faux poverty. In conclusion, that was French, by the way. I hope I got that across. Faux. In conclusion, the story of Qumran Wissenschaft mirrors the history of critical biblical studies that started out but soon challenged the following: a literalist approach to the Bible as biography and history, the sense of the Bible's literature as unique, a huge amount of confidence that we can access a reality on the ground through the prism of the texts directly, and a focus on iconic figures offering occasionally strong and stable leadership. The biblical account of Israel and Judah's national histories ended in disaster with the end of the monarchy and the destruction of the first temple in 586. However, out of that series of disasters, the Babylonian exile and subsequent dominance of Persian and Greek empires emerged a powerful biblical narrative. It did have earlier ingredients in it, but the narrative as a whole, most scholars think, went back to this period. Like all great literature, both the Hebrew Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls are concerned with ordering the world and shedding light on humanity's place within it. Our ability to analyze complex scenarios, to be resilient and reflect on our condition both as individuals and communally at a particular time and place and against a much larger historical and cosmic backdrop. This is the real reason why the Dead Sea Scrolls are incredibly significant. They take us as close as we are ever going to get to the sorts of people who wrote the Hebrew Bible, and because the people who wrote and copied the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve a great deal of the output of the ancient Jewish equivalent of the humanities. Thank you.